All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, which is Teaching Environmental Justice with Documentaries, which is sponsored by the Global Environmental Justice Documentaries Project. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. These are free to users, and they are structured 60-minute live presentations that give us the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a couple of features of the webinar software. First off, everyone who joins us today as an attendee is automatically muted and your cameras are disabled. So don't worry about generating noise or feedback. The software has got that all taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen today, we won't really be using a PowerPoint, so to speak. Our session today is really more of a discussion, but we will be playing a number of clips from the 35 documentaries that are in this series. So if you have any trouble with that, please just send me a note through the Q&A and we will troubleshoot any issues that we have with you privately there. As I mentioned, we're using the Q&A feature today. So if you have questions for any of our speakers, feel free to drop them in that Q&A module. We'll take a little time at the end to answer as many as we have time for. If we don't get to your question, we apologize in advance. We often have many more than we can get to over the course of the presentation. Also note that we are recording today's program and that everybody who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. So with that, I think we'll transition over to a quick set of introductions for each of our speakers today. All right. So today's panelists are Professor Judith Shapiro, Dr. Jake Carbine, and Mr. Gary Marquise. Dr. Judith Shapiro is on the faculty of the Global Environmental Politics program at American University and directs the dual degree in Natural Resources and Sustainable Development with University for Peace in Costa Rica. Her new book, China Goes Green, Coercive Environmentalism for a Troubled Planet with Yi-Fei Li, was published in the summer of 2020 by Polity. She's also the author of numerous books on China, and you can find her website at www.judithshapiro.com. And she was an advisor to the Global Environmental Justice Collection from its beginning in 2017. Professor Jason Jake Carbine is in the Department of Religious Studies at Whittier College, and he was the lead author on the Global Environmental Justice Documentaries Project, which grew to include 10 faculty at 4 universities, and each of them selected 5 films for the project and wrote teacher's guides for each of the films. Our final panelist today is Mr. Gary Marquise. He is the project director on the team that put together this collection. He's also a filmmaker whose work is included. Gary is a former programming executive for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and has a master's degree in environmental planning. In addition to these 3 folks, altogether there are 15 curators that you can see there on the screen from 5 different colleges who selected films and wrote teacher's guides. All right, so to kick things off, we'll transition over to just a quick reel to give you a sense of the breadth of the people involved in these documentary films. Excellent. All right. So just a little bit of background on the Global Environmental Justice Documentaries Project. It was launched just over 18 months ago and is currently available at 59 colleges and universities, and it has earned some very favorable reviews and prizes. So on December 1st, the GEJ project was named one of Choice's outstanding academic titles for 2020, and it was also named one of the top 75 resources for community colleges. And it is also a finalist in the UK Learning on Screen Awards alongside the BBC. As I mentioned throughout the webinar, we'll share a variety of clips from the project that are paired with brief commentary from some of those curators that we saw earlier on. Those snippets will really provide a launch pad for Dr. Shapiro and Dr. Carbine and Mr. Marquise for really a discussion about teaching with documentaries and teaching environmental justice in particular with documentaries. In my opinion, the clips will illustrate some of the opportunities and some of the sorts of subjects that arise while teaching with documentary films. And really to start that off, we will begin with a bit of commentary from David Mbora on the film Thank You for the Rain. So if we can cue that up, that would be great.
My name is David Mbora, and I'm an associate professor of biology and environmental science at Whittier College, which is in Los Angeles, California. And my particular discipline is community ecology. Thank You for the Rain is a very good film that looks at the life of Kisilu as a small-scale farmer. And it chronicles how Kisilu's life and the lives of his family, his children and his wife are affected by climate change. Kisilu comes from a part of Kenya that is very dry. Kisilu and his family have been going through months and months of drought. And then this one day, they're sure that the rains are coming.
Now the rain is coming. It won't take half an hour to arrive here. Yeah.
This is a scene that is very familiar to me. I'm originally from Kenya. I grew up in a place like that. I'm familiar with the joy of the first rains of the season. But that joy does not last because the storms are going to be more violent, and that means damage.
Has this ever happened before?
It also means that rain, which should fall over several weeks or many days, may just come in one huge deluge. That's because of the climate change, and that's a problem. Is another side of Kisilu, which is chronicled by the film, where we see him develop into a climate activist, someone who is training his community to plant trees. So we see him not only as a person who is affected and influenced by the effects of climate change, but someone who is working to do something about it. And I think we have an important lesson to learn from Kisilu in that respect.
Excellent. So, I mean, in that clip, we get sort of an immediate sense of the effects of climate change on farmers in Kenya, how it's already impacting their lives. And it just raises all sorts of questions to me about like justice, about climate justice, environmental justice, racial justice. And I just wondered, maybe to start with you, Judith, when you're using documentaries in class, how do you talk with your students about sort of all of those sorts of things, or in a clip like this, what sorts of discussions might come out of that?
I have to say I've not used this particular film, but I'm looking forward to doing so. I think particularly with climate change, sometimes the conversation can get a little abstract about models and treaties and, you know, nationally declared contributions. And so what we need to drive home for the students and for the people who are doing this negotiating is that this is not a fair situation, right? That the countries and entities who most benefited from putting all that fossil fuel, all that carbon into the atmosphere, are not the ones who are suffering the brunt of the impacts. And so this kind of thing puts a human face on it. We talk a lot about climate adaptation nowadays, but it can tend to be a little bit emotionally removed. So what all of these documentaries do for us in the classroom is they help us to teach not only from the head, but from the heart and from the feelings, you know, so really important.
I was going to say that this documentary for me was a real delight to find. You haven't had a chance to work with it yet because we've just put it into the collection in the last few weeks, but it has everything that I would look for in a good documentary of the kind that I just love to share with educators and students. And that is that the people in the film are obviously have a great relationship with the person behind the camera, who turns out to be a Norwegian filmmaker. But Kisilu also has his own camera and shares the kind of the directorial duties. He captures a lot of what he wants to show and then shares it with the filmmaker who only comes and goes. But Kisilu was actually documenting the life in his villages for about 5 years, and as he contributed to the film. And this film also, I think, demonstrates, well, it's the quality of that relationship. But if you watch it further, you discover that Kisilu actually gets quite involved with the Norwegian activists and is invited to attend the Paris conference on the environment. So his role just becomes increasingly large. And so, but he brings a kind of optimism and a kind of concern to the film that I think really helps people go to a place they've never been, find people that they haven't met before, and understand not only what they're doing, but how they feel about it themselves.
That's great. And go ahead, Jason, if you're going to jump in.
And to add to both of those comments, you know, I think that at the pedagogical level, decentering students from their own context and recentering them somewhere else can open up powerful avenues for learning. And one of the effective things about these documentaries, this kind of documentaries, is that they do precisely that. I mean, and especially for students that we can't get over and have them study abroad or travel abroad to see these things firsthand, they have that entry point into those worlds and seeing things that, you know, maybe resonate with their own experiences in some cases. In other cases, you know, wow, I didn't see the world that way before. So that decentering and recentering dynamic, I think, is a really vital part of what both Judith and Gary are talking about.
And I think one of the...
Go ahead, Gary.
I was just going to say...
let's go with Gary, and then maybe Judith,
After
you can follow
okay.
up.
All right, he's told us to. Just that if you see the teacher's guide as well, and from what David Mbora has said, he's from that region, so he's able to write with great authority and to also write about the fact that this represents what hundreds of millions of people are facing whose life depends on the land itself. And that kind of eclipses a lot of other concerns, but it's a story that's not often told. It's an underreported story from my point of view. And so it's a good one to kind of get back into the classroom. It's so hard for filmmakers often when they make these great stories to get in touch with students and faculty because there's a kind of a paywall that exists in between you know, the filmmaker and the audience, because the distributors have to charge a certain amount for it. And so what we're trying to do is break down that wall so that more films can flow across it and more of these underrepresented stories are also available.
That's great. And I'm sure we'll talk about that even a little more further into the conversation. I'm sorry, Judith, we cut you off. Well,
no, let's go to the next one.
All right. Great. So yeah, let's do that. Let's pull up the next film, which is a clip from a film called Plastic China. Excuse me there, Plastic China.
My name is Ken Berthel, and I teach courses in language, literature, and culture, including film studies at Whittier College in the Los Angeles area. I chose Plastic China for a number of reasons, but one thing that I really like about it is that it challenges our oversimplified notion that we're doing unquestioned environmental good through simple acts like tossing a plastic bottle in a recycling bin.
你刚才那个塑料吧，给我叠的舒服呢。打一个农民来说的话，可以了。
When I first used this film in a classroom setting in 2009, of the things that they had discarded. There are a number of scenes in the film that I appreciated. For example, Yijie, the little girl who finds Western fashion in discarded magazines and cuts out images to create paper dolls. And she uses them to create a sort of idealized household, a family to populate a home that she dreamed about. Or the boys who find the images of conspicuous leisure, people sunning themselves on a Caribbean resort beach.
这是个美国，这是个美国，美国人家说大海风亮，这本来就是个美国。
But I think all of this reaches its highest point later on in the film, in a scene where that factory owner takes his entire family to a car show.
看看有什么货车，咱这里先去看看啊，先去看看先找鱼铺啊，时间找在后面，走。
At this point, I feel like the film turns its attention away from the Western consumer and more toward the rise of consumerism in China. It serves as a kind of warning or reflection point on what will happen next.
Excellent. All right. So, to me, watching that, it just brings up all sorts of issues, really. Even like watching the way that, you know, as the little girl is cutting out the shoes to fill sort of an imaginary closet. As Ken Berthel points out in there, you know, it makes us question what something that we may just think of as an unquestioned good, like doing recycling and those sorts of things. And he talks about consumerism in the US and abroad. I guess my question in teaching with documentaries is, how do you talk about topics like that with students, and how do the documentaries themselves facilitate that discussion? And maybe Jason, could you start talking about that?
Yeah, a couple points. I have an intro to globalization class where, as a first step to thinking about these issues, I ask the students just to begin to reflect on, as much as possible, their relationship between themselves and the products that they use in their everyday lives, their clothes, their food, and then begin to try to unpack the networks that produce those things and look at the linkages between themselves and other people. And so if it's, you know, if it's something as simple as the plastic and bottles and the magazines, but also something about the food supply chains as well. And the documentary, like Plastic China and others, sort of, again, provide that grounding for opening up a beginning consideration of many of those issues. And I know that, Judith, you could probably say more here.
Yeah, I love this film, and I'm really starting to use it in all my classes. I don't care what class it is. What I love about the film particularly is the way it focuses on that one family, and you get to know that little girl really, really well. And so it's so easy for students to kind of bracket off the consequences of what they do and all of the benefits that they have in the world. And this makes it impossible to put it aside. And actually, I just asked my students to post what their big takeaway of the course that I just finished. And one of them said, the image that's going to stay with me for the rest of my life is that little girl who couldn't go to school because she worked in a recycling factory in China. You get to love this little girl and to be also so sort of viscerally grossed out by the environment that she lives in. We saw that with her washing her face, right? And yet there's no bad people, right? There's no bad people in this movie. Even her own somewhat abusive father, different than the one we saw in the clip, you know, he's not really a bad person either. He's trying, he has no options. And so that's where justice comes in. Sometimes we ask, so what does it mean, justice, right? And stuff isn't fair, right? It's not fair. And what's unfair is that these people that this is the best choice available for these people, right? They've actually been really creative and courageous to travel from a remote area to this factory. They're migrant workers, and this is the best option that they have. And yet this really upperly mobile factory owner, another character we don't hear in the clip, he's riddled with tumors from this same environment, right? So the injustice, the unfairness is the disproportionate suffering of harm, right, of one people as compared with another. We talk about spatial injustice and also temporal injustice. So there's the spatial injustice of displacing environmental harm from wealthier areas to poorer areas, either internationally or domestically. And we also talk about the temporal injustice, where we've basically stolen from our children by using up all the resources of the earth. Really fascinating, rich material. And as I said, this one more thing about this film. One time I was showing it pre-COVID as a group, and after the film, some of the students were crying, and it opened them up because they thought about some situation in their own life, and that allowed us to get to a place with each other that was more real, right? So it's not words on a page anymore, it's not words on a page. And I'm not afraid of upsetting students. Sometimes people think, oh, well, they're going to have nightmares or something. But, it's a hard world, right? So we need to know about this stuff. And then we need to realize that, okay, now we know about it. So what are our options? What can we do to make it better?
That's great. Yeah. So one thing we've sort of been talking about, but that we haven't, we've been talking about environmental justice and climate justice and those sorts of things. And I just wondered if maybe it would be useful to just pause and maybe, is it possible to succinctly define environmental justice and what it means? Would you be willing to take a crack at that, Judith?
Yeah. There's a million definitions. It's a little bit as bad as sustainable development, right? There's really lots and lots of definitions. But there's two ends of it. One has to do with the unequal access to the resource that's being extracted, right? So oftentimes you have a mine in Africa and the local people are suffering all of the toxicity, but they're not getting any of the revenue from this mine, right? So there's unequal access to the resource, but then disproportionate suffering of the harm that comes from the disposal of the resource. So, this gets to the whole question of, can we go from a cradle to grave economy to a cradle to cradle economy, right? So we're not constantly using, and they always say, lesson 101 in environmental politics is there's no such thing as throwing anything away. There is no away. And that's why plastic china is so powerful, because everybody recognizes science diet. You probably feed it to your kitten. And so that immediately then starts to uncover the hidden ties between the consumer, i.e. you, me, us, and the person who's receiving the harm. But there's a longer history there. Maybe some of the others would like to talk about it, but environmental justice originates actually in the Middle Atlantic states in the United States, in the Black churches. The United Church of Christ was one of the big mobilizers, and it was very much tied with the civil rights movement. And it started way out in Warren County, North Carolina, with some disposal of PCBs along a highway. And the more this was studied in the US, the more it was discovered conclusively that the single most reliable predictor of whether you live next to a toxic waste dump is the color of your skin, period, incontrovertible. So it's really in a way, if you were going to give a discipline, it's a sociological discipline. It's about race, class, ethnicity, and gender. So of course, in the US, it often ends up being about race, but it's also about the Latino migrant workers, and it's about the Native Americans who are near the uranium mines or dealing with the Standing Rock pipeline. And it's about how women are disproportionately harmed by environmental degradation. But then you can extrapolate overseas, right? And some of these insights about displacement of environmental harm are completely applicable internationally. And it's not only race, right? It's also like we're whites in the mountains of West Virginia dealing with mountaintop mining removal. So anyway, so yeah, that wasn't a definition.
Yeah. To add to that, Gary is talking about, you're muted, Gary.
There, my apologies, getting a lot of silence out there. Mountaintop removal, by the way, that film called The Last Mountain is also in the collection. From my point of view, just to summarize it, it feels to me like there's an intersection between human rights and environmental protection that we're now recognizing. And I came across a nice formulation of that yesterday, which said that environmental sustainability reduces inequality. And so the two are just tightly linked. You just cannot separate the environment from equality issues. And particularly when you get outside of the developed countries, where the environment, it can also be called, the air we breathe and the water we drink. When you get to other countries, it's often the issue is about land, because land is the source of everything for so many people. And so a lot of the films in the collection address the point of view of what's happening to the land that these people are entitled to or have rights to, which is being taken away from them, and reduces the quality of life and often isolates them from the benefits that they need as well. Sorry, Jake.
Go ahead, Jason. Well, I was going to say that this could maybe bring us to Gary's film about the dams in China too. We could maybe show it then.
Yeah, we could. Well, let's let Jason have a quick say. Sorry.
To go back to a point that Judith made about the multiplicity of possible definitions and ways of analyzing environmental justice, or as in a previous conversation that she brought up with us, environmental injustice. The teacher's guides for the curated films have a specific component that says, why I chose this film, but then it has what is the environmental justice focus of this film? So those, that sort of, the analysis of environmental justice gets sort of highlighted in the context of, or the positioning of the documentary in relationship to that topic gets done in certain ways in the teacher's guides themselves. And then the second point here is that the level of teaching, oftentimes I find it extremely useful to show these documentaries, whichever ones I'm using at a particular point in time, and ask the students to, answer the question based on the documentary, how would you define environmental justice? And that's sort of an empowering moment, because they have some evidence in front of them and they begin to construct an answer to the question that then may prompt further things along the way. So there's just a couple notes that sort of work in tandem with what both Judith and Gary have said.
Yeah, at its core, it's a political question. Who wins, who loses? Who benefits, who doesn't benefit, right? So.
I have to say, as a filmmaker, I get so excited when I see the work that I've done and other filmmakers that I know have done get into the hands of teachers, turn up in a classroom and generate this kind of engagement. It's just it's a kind of the dream that filmmakers have, that their films will actually stimulate that kind of discourse and dialogue. But very often, of course, it's shown at 11 o'clock at night and people don't remember it the next day. And their next opportunity is two small film festivals. It's just hard to circulate these things. So when they do get into the classroom, they kind of open a window and bring the world into that classroom. And we're excited as filmmakers to provide it, and then twice as excited to see it recognized and utilized.
Can I add one important thing? Because I just read the questions, and Cami asked about the relationship between plastic China and the recycling ban, the waste import ban. Really interesting situation there, because on the one hand, the filmmaker started to be very politically repressed. And a friend of mine who teaches, actually, he's also in the series, Ife Lee, he wrote the guide for, I think, Waking the Green Tiger, right?
Under the Dome.
Under the Dome, okay. But anyway, they were trying to invite the filmmaker to come speak at NYU Shanghai, and the filmmaker said, I can't, I'm being followed everywhere by the secret police. You know, I'm like, they say in Chinese, you say, well, I'm wearing small shoes. But it's precisely that loss of face and that publicity that came around plastic China that helped the Chinese government to say, guess what? You know what? We're great now. We're a great nation. We shouldn't be taking other countries' trash. And that, I think, ultimately is really positive if you take a global view and say, well, maybe the producers and the consumers should deal with their trash. You know, your mother said, clean up your own room, right? You know, don't farm it out. And so as a result, other countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, they've all said, you know what, China's not taking their trash. Why should we take that trash? So this is a global movement.
Interestingly, Ife Lee was able to actually view the film in Shanghai after all, because he's a member of the NYU faculty, and he could sign into the faculty library. And since NYU subscribes to the series, they were able to view it over that line. I don't know if they can still do that in China now.
They're in a bubble. It's different for them. Yeah. He couldn't invite the filmmaker to give a presentation. That was the problem.
Right. And I think that's an illustration of the kind of impact that a documentary can have sometime, which is a little segue for me into the story of what happened in Waking the Green Tiger. One of the promises that was made when China was building dams was that all the displaced people would get compensation and fresh land if they were farmers and had been moved off the land. When we were making the film there, shooting in 2010, there was a kind of still a current flowing from a proposal that had been on the New River to build some dams there, which were subsequently postponed, if not canceled. But a group of farmers who lived closer to Kunming in Yunnan province had been told in the mid-1980s if they gave up their land for the dam, they would be well compensated and get fresh land. This turned out not to be true, and it wasn't true for a lot of the 2 million people who were moved. They were badly compensated. But in the neighboring valley, just like a few hours drive away, the farmers were being told that they would get all these lovely benefits, and yet in the case of the other farmers, they got none and were reduced to poverty. And all of this was documented by my co-director, Xu Lihong, when she was doing a study of a controversy about the dam. So I want to show you 2 clips. The first clip shows the farmers who are thinking about giving up their land on a bus on their way to visit with the farmers who gave up their land, not realizing what they were going to encounter when they came together in a meeting. So if we could play that first clip, it'll take you to the reservoir and to a garbage dump.
现在呢，你们看看，就是那边捡垃圾的这些人呢，他们就是过去那个田坝村的人，是吧？田坝村的人。那么我们现在，
应该还有地呢？
不有，
不有地
钱不有地。
哎呦，地去哪去了？
没地都，那是国家占用了。
国家占用那个？
哦，钱占用了，地占用了。
你觉得搬掉的以前好吗？是现在好？
哎，我那说不到。经常不，我们说他违法了，在经常不成的时候呢嘛，我们是生活好了，我们一天，我们4么半天是我们一年能拿那个6千斤工资。现在嘛，天不要地不要嘛，一样不要嘛。 钱们不是政府吃完了，我们不够，我们收不到。
So once this filming, this story was beginning to be captured on film, the activists had a certain kind of quandary, like, what do you do with this film? You couldn't possibly show it on television. There's no broadcaster who's going to touch it because it's on a really touchy subject. And there turned out to have been some graft involved, which is part of the reason these people never got compensation or the land properly. And the land that they did receive was too dry, didn't have water. So how did that help? What the filmmakers did was that they created a little 20-minute tape because they wanted to educate people in a neighboring valley to inform them that the promises that they were being given might not come through. And they might want to reconsider about whether or not they want to give up their land. And this would be like 100,000 people were being asked to give up their land. So in the next clip, what you'll see is that the little 20-minute film that they made was taken around and shown in all the villages up and down the upper Yangtze River where people were being asked to give up their land. And as you can see from this, the response to this was quite powerful.
国家征用啊？
国家占用那个？
哦，钱征用了，这征用了。
都有就给他给石头了不啦？俺给石头不花，我们要晓不得。
俺都不办了。
保持了门期罚是100万倍。
现在那是在那个养过了，
一花过了喜欢搬家，一过了比搞这。
我打算做什么？我要发动些群众了嘛，要解决这要不同意这些搬迁，如果搬了，我们就是过不成日子了，就是这个。
So this debate about that dam, as you can see, the response was pretty powerful. And I would point out that those people in the village there are looking at a camera. Behind the camera is not me, it's Sheila Hong, because nothing like that would have happened if I had been there with the camera. As a foreigner, I would have been just completely disruptive, and that probably wouldn't have been invited in the first place. So this is where a collaboration can help to get the story out of China as well, to be seen by others in my documentary. But inside China, the creation of this response, this particular little documentary was passed from village to village, all up and down the valley. And it led to a series of demonstrations that erupted into such a conflict that it generated a national debate, which the premier then commented on, and the dam itself was, if not completely canceled, postponed ever since. The dam has not been built to date. And so this little piece of footage had its place in the history of the generation of a green movement in China itself. So it's very kind of exciting for me as a filmmaker, but very important for the people involved who now had the truth. They had the facts about what could happen as opposed to just the promises.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is very cool because the film within a film. And it also helps students understand that, especially when you teach China, people sort of think of China as a monolithic. The Chinese are this way, the Chinese are that way. And the more you see these films, you realize there's 1.4 billion people, each one is an individual, and there's a lot of variety. And you see the poignancy of these parallel rivers, right? That they're just over the mountain, but they have no links to each other. And it wasn't until the activists took a busload of them over the mountain to see what happened when the bed dam was built and these people were displaced, that they had the knowledge to know to resist. So in political theory, we sort of talk about green grabbing nowadays. It's similar to land grabbing, but in the name of renewable energy, they build these dams and they sort of grab land, for environmental purposes, but actually it's for other kinds of purposes a lot of the time. A really interesting film. Yeah, the other thing is Shirley Hong herself was in some trouble, right? She does say at one point in the film, the police were following after me and they were asking, what are you doing here? And then she laughs, yeah, Like just like, yeah.
A few years later, this film was actually given a China Green Film Award, which we picked up in Beijing. But the award was given out by the Asia Society. And at that point, somebody was following us around trying to tell all the venues where we were trying to show this film that we were anti-government. So it had a kind of a mixed response as well because of that.
You know,
yeah, just one more note about this film really fast is I often use this film not in my environmental justice units, but in my civil society units, right? Because they can really show what a green movement is like in an authoritarian situation.
Yeah, you know, we screened this video on campus here at Whittier College with great success. We probably had 180 students in the audience, and that became a springboard for what developed into an alternative to spring break a year and a half after showing that. But a number of those students who were involved in that screening actually ended up on that alternative spring break to China, where we actually went and we got aligned with Shirley Hong, and we visited her home, and we visited some of the other places that were involved in the film. And the students were able to meet with some of the activists and actually sort of hear from them directly their further thoughts on everything. Just a really incredible set of interchanges that were really inspired and made possible by that initial moment of showing and doing the documentary in the way that we did. I can say more about that in a moment, but there's something about, you know, we've been talking about the decentering and recentering and all these other issues, but, you know, sometimes they can be inspiring for getting students over to another place and actually beginning to do some independent study and work there on their own.
And I guess it also in the age of COVID, you know, they're kind of marking time until they're going to be able to travel again. So this is a great way to do some virtual traveling, more important, in fact, than ever, I think, to use film.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that's one of the things about this collection is that it is all available online in a single place. So I guess what I'd like to talk about a little bit is maybe to give you, Jason, a chance to talk about some of the ways that you've used these documentaries in classes. I know you've had several classes where, or at least one, if I'm not mistaken, where these were essentially the text.
Yeah, you know, pedagogically, the processes varied a great deal. So to highlight maybe 3 examples, we did as part of a class across sociology, religious studies, and political science, we did a showing of dams, drugs, and democracy. There was a campus event. And for that campus event, what we did is we took the study guide questions from the teacher's guide, gave them to the students. There were about 50 students in the room. We watched the whole thing. And then after that, we grouped them into about groups of 5 to 8, asked them to address 2 to 3 questions amongst themselves for about 15 minutes. And we brought that whole room back to a larger singular discussion, which is great effect. So that's one thing, sort of the campus viewing as one type of pedagogical classroom experience. The second one I alluded to earlier, I have an introduction to globalization. That is the core course for the global and cultural studies major, which is a department that I also teach in. And there, what I did is I've used a few of the GEJ films, but in the last iteration, I tried an experiment and I paired The True Cost with a reading on the chicken industry. And again, just to get students to think about networks, winners, losers, the harm that these things do, consumers, consumption, food, clothes, etc. And it was really interesting. The results are really interesting out of that. The third one was an entire course that I basically took the GEJ idea, an introduction to writing. It's part of our general education curriculum and liberal arts education course. And the goal in that course is to get students to write better, but the content was built out of the GEJ films. And so, for instance, you know, to go back to, I didn't use Waking the Green Tiger, but I used Before the Flood 1 and 2, which are quite lengthy. So I used little segments of these, and I paired those up with segments from Dams, Drugs, and Democracy, and then asked the students for their first paper, for instance, hey, you know, what are the problems, the benefits, the drawbacks of dam construction in China and in Myanmar? So they built their paper out of a consideration of the GEJ docs that I was showing. That writing seminar was also had a special component to it, because I decided that I was going to try to build into the flow of the class collaboration with the students to write a new guide. And that's what led to the genesis of the 5x5, and then the Voices of Change or Hope, and then an additional film that we added onto that. So there was actually quite a, in the context of that class, there were several different varied experiences that the students had with the GEJ collection ideas. And they really, I mean, they really got into the collaboration. They were compelled by it. They were doing the searching online. They were trying to find research sources. They were trying to find out more about the NGOs that were involved in working with the people to deal with the deforestation and other things. And it really was something kind of special that emerged out of that. So there are those three contexts that sort of highlight the range of things that I tend to do with the docs from the GEJ.
Excellent. And Judith, you mentioned COVID and teaching remotely. How has that changed how you use the documentaries, you know, in your classes?
Well, originally I had a fantasy that we would all like be watching the movie together and we'd chatting away, and it just turned out that Zoom wasn't that friendly that way. And so
it takes some work. Yeah.
And there's lag, and I mean, there's apparently a way you can like watch a movie together on some other software, but I never got that far. So what I ended up doing was the library would make these films accessible through the reserves tab. And then they would see it on their own time, and then they would have discussion board, and they would have to react to the film on the discussion board. Then they might read each other's posts, maybe not. And then I would divide them up into little discussion groups, and then they would be able to react, you know, emotionally about that poor little girl. Whatever happened? Did she ever get to go to school? Oh, I want to hug her, you know. And so that worked really well. I think really, really well.
Great. So I wanted to make sure that we had, looking at the clock, that we have a little time, maybe just to talk specifically about the project, because we've been talking sort of about the documentaries in it, and how they're used in class. But there's a bit of a history here with you, Jason, I think, starting this whole process rolling with the Global Environmental Justice Documentaries Project. There was an initial grant or something that
yeah, I think saying that I got the things rolling might be a bit of an overstatement.
Okay.
But certainly I had a crucial role in leveraging really important energy on campus. A few years ago, I started directing, we had a loose initiative on Asian Studies and the Environment grant. And for its inaugural year, we had invited Gary and Shirley Hong and Liu Zhenchang, who were also involved in various ways in environmental reporting and activism in China, to come to campus and to actually show Waking the Green Tiger. And what we did is we also inserted them into classes for a whole week. We worked them pretty hard. They were really, really busy. But out of those meetings, inclusive of some that Gary had with students and also Li Hong and Liu Zhenchang, we began to talk about, you know, what would it look like if we generated a documentary project that was useful at the level of teaching, but also accessible to people who might not be specialists in the field. And so we came up with this idea about a working group, and we built that working group out of some of the folk who were involved in the Luce grant. And as discussions sort of began to unfold, I worked with Gary on a proposal, and we soon realized, or I soon realized, that I really wasn't going to be able to direct two grants simultaneously, that the GEJ campus leader really needed to have their own energy. And so what I did is I asked a colleague in sociology whose field is who specializes in environmental justice stuff, if she'd be willing to come on as the campus director for that. And she did. And then, you know, there were a number of other conversations that Gary was having with people like Judith and of, you know, a whole range of other people. Gary can speak to those. But so I certainly had a role in the Whittier campus experience, but also because of the particular position that I was in, already directing a grant that had a third of the faculty on Whittier College campus involved in across the 3 divisions of the curriculum. So we had in some ways a fortuitous kind of synergism going on when Gary and Shirley Hong and Neil Jenchong arrived, and then that coalesced and got built out into a second grant application, which was the GEJ.
Shall I comment here?
Please jump in,
very
Gary.
briefly. I'm conscious of the fact that people are waiting to get some of their questions asked or answered, rather. But from my point of view, I was having a campus tour, but spent quite a lot of time at Whittier College because they had this program going. And for me, I feel like what was driving all this was the desire of the students to gain some skills and ability to analyze and understand environmental issues in a way that they could then participate and contribute to their solution. But this was a big difference from 10 years earlier when I had been touring, where the feeling was one then of kind of a fatigue, of an exhaustion, all these bad stories about the environment. People were just depressed. But somehow over 5 to 10 years, that had changed a lot. People were looking for ways to get involved in many different subject areas. And when I was at Whittier, I felt like I put my finger on an electrical circuit, because I was just asking the teachers, the faculty, whether they had enough documentaries, would they like some more? And the next thing I knew, the committee had been organized. There were 10 people writing for it. We were looking to the Luce Foundation for a grant for the Asian Studies portion of it. And the whole thing just kind of flowered into being with the help of a kind of, I guess, collaboration between academics, filmmakers, and the foundation. And the foundation eventually underwrote all of the cost of creating all these teacher's guides, which no normal distributor will do because they're expensive and time consuming and difficult to do. But this was a collegial thing. People participated for honoraria. It just had this whole quality of transparency and participation that made it possible to generate it and then to cut the price way, 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 way back. And I think that's an important element in this as well, is that we tried to lower the cost all the way down to about $400 a year on a 3-year subscription, which is really only the cost of 2 or 3 individual films, and we got 35. So we're hoping if we get the mix right, we can go on finding more audiences with the community colleges, and then maybe on a second small grant, devise ways of making these accessible to high school students and secondary teachers as well. So the whole project has lots of ambitions to it.
The beauty is really the teacher guides, right? Because you don't have to know anything about it to use it in your classroom.
Yeah, and the guides are written.
Guides, yeah.
They're written by classroom teachers.
Right.
I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, and across disciplines. I mean, they're not rooted in one particular kind of.
Yeah, each guide suggests 8 or 10 different subject areas where you could use that film.
Yeah.
All right. Well, looking at the time, we have just a few minutes left, really, in the hour. And we have
one more theme. I want
all right, go ahead,
one
Judith.
more theme.
Yeah.
A lot of these films deal with the production of something, whether it's Blue Jeans or some of these, another film about Mardi Gras beads. And the students feel as if that teaches them to be, I think actually Jason already mentioned this, but be very aware that everything that comes into their life was made somewhere, and that they're going to be super aware of asking that question about that, and they become really curious about that. I think that's like, it's basically a global political economy kind of understanding. And I think that that's absolutely essential that these films, many of these films do that.
And I might add too, for the librarians in the audience, that the films are distributed on a platform called DocuSeek 2. And that has the full suite of accessibilities. You can make clips, you can review things, you can basically all the MARC records are available for cataloging. It's just everything that you would expect if you were looking at a professional distribution system.
Excellent. I would like to take at least a couple of questions from the audience. And one of them that sort of relates to what you were just talking about, maybe Judith actually, is from the Gemmell Library. And the Gemmell Library asks, how does the curriculum have students turn to activism after educating? So do you, and you were even talking a little bit about this, Jason, as well, with organizing the trip to China after. So do you see these films and have you seen students move from like learning about environmental justice into actual activism because of the films or the teaching or the courses?
For me, I define in my mind activism very broadly, and certainly at the graduate level, all of the students who come into a global environmental politics program or a natural resources and sustainable development program, you know, they're already there, right? But activism could mean working for the EPA, right? Or
Yep.
it could mean starting a community garden, or it could mean, you know, organizing indigenous people to resist investment. And it can mean a lot of things. Now, activism has a certain connotation, but I think everybody has a different teaching philosophy. I think my job is to, I don't know, reveal the connections, and then ultimately what they do with that is their business. You know, I would never say we're in this class and then we're going to go together and change the world in a certain way. It's up to them how they want to change the world.
Yeah, it's often a very organic sort of impact. And a case in point would be one of the students. There are actually several of the students who are very interested in going on in environmental related majors after that seminar. But one in particular got done with it and said, you know, I want to do a self-designed major in environmental activism. And so then the next question is, well, what do you think? What are you thinking of doing? Is indigenous rights, land and water? And so then we began to piece out who else he should be talking with on campus. So, you know, the other thing is Whittier is about 60% students of color, 60 to 65% students of color. So many of them come in some ways with some knowledge of the kinds of things that we're been talking about today. But that student is a case in point, and I've seen cases like that repeated since being involved with even with the Liaise project going into GEJ. But yeah, definitely.
Great, and we've got a question here, a couple of questions that I'll tie together for Gary. And first off, a question from Patrick that says simply, what is the name of the streaming platform? So it's
DocuSeek 2.
DocuSeek 2, okay.
And you can find us just globalenvironmentaljustice.com.
Excellent. And then
all one word.
Yep. And then Lorraine is curious about the cost. Have we talked about cost yet? Came in a few minutes late. So what does it cost to put these 35 documentaries into your library?
The cost is on a 1-year or 3-year license is what we're responding to the demand. 1 year is $4.95, but we're finding most people are taking a 3-year, which is basically $3.95 per year. So under $400. One of the librarians pointed out to me that this is a cost of $13 per film, you know, per year. So pretty modest in price overall. And for that, we really have to thank our underwriters. And frankly, that's the universities who subscribe to this, we feel like they're part of our project. They're subscribing it. It's underwriting, you know, and we just need a few more of them to make this thing stand on its own 2 feet when our grants run out.
Excellent. All right, and I'm looking through. We've got another question from Lorraine who asks, is this just for the university community? How do you see that, Gary?
Well, anybody who belongs to a university library can access it. So if you have to be a student in order to be part of your library, that's a limitation for us. So we don't really have the rights from the filmmakers for just kind of generally showing it on a big screen downtown somewhere. But I'm sure if somebody wanted to do that, the filmmakers would be happy to collaborate with them in doing so.
But couldn't a high school system purchase this as well?
We think so. We invite high schools to, we're just trying to figure out now how much adaptation we need to make in order to make this really relevant to what kind of different lesson plans would be needed for secondary level. So we're looking at 9 to 12 at the moment, but I do invite any teachers who are in that area to contact us and join our discussion about how much can high schools afford? How low should we cut this price in order to make it accessible to them? Because we think that we know this, that those institutions are really out of money. You know, they don't have much. So we're working on that.
Yeah, excellent. So we have a question. I am mindful that we're running just a little over, so I apologize to those of you out there, but we appreciate your sticking with us. We have a question from Lisa who asks, are there going to be more than 35 films?
The short answer is yes. Until about 3 weeks ago, we were only 25 films, but we're trying to add 2 to 5 each year, depending on how much we have in the way of resources.
Yeah, excellent. We've got a question here from Madeline who asks, is there a free trial offer or?
Absolutely. You can go to docuseek2.com, just write sales at docuseek2.com. They can set up a free campus-wide 30-day trial. Any faculty member can also go in and just sign in with their university's name and get to preview the first 10 minutes of everything. So it's just well set up to allow you to kind of explore it before you commit.
Yeah, so this is actually one of the questions that I wanted to ask earlier that we just didn't have time for. But Allison asks, can you show these movies in a group setting in an academic environment, not just in class, but like outside of class?
Absolutely. Anybody who belongs to a university has access through their library. If the library is a subscriber, they can do it from distance education. They can do it on their own devices. They can sit with a group of people. We've copyright cleared for the films for all those kinds of educational uses.
Yeah, so that seems to me.
Yeah,
go ahead.
We've made ample use of that because our students can independently access the films. And anyone involved in the institution, the faculty, staff, and students can access the films through our library.
Yeah, we had a student in Brazil who was signed up with one of the universities so they could watch it from Brazil. They just had to sign into their university online.
Excellent. All right. Well, we have lots of other questions in the hopper, I see, and we'll provide those to you, Gary, so that after this, if you want to follow up with folks, you can.
We'd be delighted. Yeah.
At this point, I would just say thank you so much, Gary and Jason and Judith, for taking the time to present today and to talk through how you use these documentaries and to share your experiences. It's been really interesting and informative. Thank you. And I would just say thanks to everyone out there who tuned in. We appreciate your taking the time to do so. And as we get ready to sign out here, if you have just 1 or 2 more minutes to fill out a very brief survey, it should pop up on your browser there. We really appreciate any responses that you might have to today's presentation. They help us make them as good as we can. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in the near future on another webinar. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Thanks for hosting, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks everybody for attending.
Bye-bye.
Bye.